Welcome to the very first Personalist Manifesto's conversation. My name is Michael, and in this conversation, I'm speaking with Daniel Cérézuelle. I'll tell you more about Daniel in a moment, but before I do that, I want to tell you a little bit about what Personalist Manifestos is, because this is a brand new project supported by the International Jacques Ellul Society, and you probably don't know what it is. We want to have conversations inspired by the personalist thought and action of Jacques Ellul and Bernard Charbonneau. The kinds of conversations we'll be having will, broadly speaking, fall into one of two categories, and sometimes they'll fall into a little bit of both. First, we want to have conversations about Ellul and Charbonneau's personalism and its significance for today. Second, we want to have conversations inspired by Ellul and Charbonneau's personalist thought and action. So discussions that are adjacent to their life and work, and in some cases, carry it into new territory. Now, at this point, you might be asking, okay, but what is personalism? Well, that's a great question. I'm so glad you're asking it. A lot of our conversations will give us extended answers to this question, but in short form, here's a sketch of what personalism was, what it is, and what it can be. Together in 1935, Ellul and Charbonneau wrote the following in an essay titled Origins of Our Revolt, Directives for a Personalist Manifesto. Quote, "We see the necessity for revolution precedes us. Catholics, Protestants, atheists who believe in the necessity of spiritual power must make this revolution our primary concern. It is not something we have thought up on our own. It is the brutal manifestation of a reality that has been imposed upon us. So we are revolutionaries in spite of ourselves." Well, what kind of revolution are they talking about? And is it a good kind of revolution? In the conclusion of their essay, Ellul and Charbonneau describe it in the following way, and you can decide whether you think it's good. They write, "Not a revolution against people, but against institutions. Too bad for police who protect the banks. Not a revolution against big bosses, but against big factories. Not a revolution against the bourgeois, but against big cities. Not a revolution against fascism or communism, but against the totalitarian state, whatever form it takes. Not a revolution against advertisers, but against ad agencies. Not a revolution against 200 families, but against profit. Not a revolution against arms dealers, but against arms. Not a revolution against foreign nations, but against our own. Revolution not as class struggle, but as struggle for the freedom of all people." And then they conclude, "The reason we reject the first term in each of the preceding cases is because such terms permit every sort of hypocrisy and are just as well suited to fascist revolutions as to communist ones, whereas the second term allows no compromise." Okay, so with that introduction and that quick sketch of personalism, let me tell you about Daniel. I'll put his full bio in the notes, but I'll say here that Daniel is the kind of person who has a resume that makes a person like me feel lazy and unproductive. But he's such a welcoming and thoughtful person with a wealth of first-hand knowledge to share about Ellul, Charbonneau, personalism, and so much more. And so with that said, let's hear from Daniel.
It's a kind of family legacy, in a way. I would say that becoming an Ellulian or a Charbonneau scholar happened to me more by fate than by choice. And it is a consequence of a family story, in fact. My father, Henri Cérézuelle, he's dead now. He was born in 1920, and he befriended Ellul and Charbonneau in 1936.
Hmm.
And he has participated in most of the camps or kind of mini summer universities, which Ellul and Charbonneau organized from the late 30s to the 60s. Now, besides, during Second World War, my aunt, Edith Cérézuelle, had participated with Ellul in a resistance network, which helps saving the lives of many Jews. And well, that was a kind of dangerous endeavor. And well, both of them and my aunt and Jacques Ellul and a few other people received the title of Just Among the Nation from the Yad Vashem organization. Okay, so there was some, already very active connection between the previous generation of Cérézuelle family and Charbonneau and Ellul. Mhm. Now, I remember that Ellul was one of the rare men whose authority my mother would not challenge. Mhm. She had a deep respect for him. And I remember very clearly that I was in my 14 or 15 when Jacques Ellul and his wife and their daughter Dominique came for lunch at our home one Sunday. And I remember how we explained to my mother which part of a leg of mutton should be carved lengthwise or sidewise and how to do it properly. And I was very impressed, you know. Mhm.
Ellul
Okay,
did that.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. He was the guest, but he was teaching my mother how to do it properly.
Well,
Uh,
yeah.
so
That's amazing.
I remember also very clearly that in 1966, I was then 17, and I read La technique ou l'enjeu du siècle, which has been translated as a technological society, which was in my parents' bookshelves. Mhm. And I was quite young, but the reading of this book was a turn point in my intellectual life. And it helped me to put words on my uneasiness with many aspects of the world which I was discovering then. That was the time when I decided that I would study philosophy at Bordeaux University. And I must say that my work was was not well received because at that time, critical thinking of technology was among the philosophers a bit anathemous.
Mm.
It was not correct, I would say. And I remember the reaction of some members of the jury when I defended my little dissertation, and saying, "Oh, we don't like Mr. Ellul. I mean, this is not
Right.
acceptable." Huh?
Right. What year would
So
have that been in that you defended, just for context?
I would say probably 71
Right. It
or
is interesting.
70, 70.
Yeah, it is interesting because now it's so common to read works that are critical of technology or hear speakers that are raising critical questions about technology. But I don't think we can underestimate just how unique Ellul's voice was and Charbonneau's voice was at their time, where coming
Yes.
out of, would you say, coming out of the sort of post-war reconstruction That
exactly. It was a
everybody
time
was
of,
very positive about technology because that was the way forward. And so to have anybody raising objections to that, it was
Mhm.
definitely going against the grain of what everybody was hoping would help rebuild.
Yes, it was a time of technological euphoria.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm. And for example, at that time, for example, the thought of Teilhard de Chardin was very fashionable, this uh, progressist metaphysics.
Mm.
And so Ellul was not uh, trendy, to say the least.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so nevertheless, in spite of this, well, I got my master, but uh, I was not encouraged by my professors of philosophy, but I decided I would do uh, my PhD on the same topic. And Charbonneau and Ellul had created the Comité de défense de la Côte d'Aquitaine, um, a grassroots organization, would you say,
Yes.
for opposing at the local level the French state's policy of a large-scale touristic development on the Atlantic coast near Bordeaux. Mhm. And Charbonneau was the first president of this organization, and my father was the secretary. And actually, this committee, this organization, met uh, regularly in the house where I live now, where I live today. And then later, Ellul became the president of this organization, and I took over the role of secretary. So, so you see, first my father, then me as
Right.
secretaries, and Ellul and Charbonneau as presidents. So I worked with them in this grassroots organization. And then a few years later, um, I think it was in the late 80s, 89 or 87 probably, Charbonneau and Ellul launched something which they call the Groupe du Chêne, the, or we could call it the Oak Society,
Hmm.
which was in fact an unsuccessful attempt at creating a think tank for the French very young ecological movement.
Right. The ecological
And
movement before there was such a thing.
yeah,
Yeah.
and and again, I served for several years as secretary of this group and had many occasions to collaborate with Ellul and Charbonneau. Let's turn to Charbonneau now. Again, it's a family legacy. Uh, mm, and my relationship with Ellul was mostly based since the beginning uh, on intellectual and spiritual issues.
Hmm.
Uh, with Charbonneau, it was very different. I would say that my first uh, interaction with Charbonneau was based on sharing pleasure, the pleasure of living, of being alive in nature.
Hmm.
So, uh, Charbonneau, like Ellul, was a friend of my father, and he met the two of them in 36. At that time, my father was a teenager. In 36, he was 16. And he met them through Protestant youth organization in Bordeaux. And of course, he was fascinated by the intellectual acuity of both of them. And he attended discussion groups organized by Charbonneau and Ellul. But my father was also attracted to Charbonneau's sense of nature. Uh, and he would participate in long treks with Charbonneau in the forest, in the mountains, or they would go on fishing trips. Uh, and in 1948, that's the year I was born, actually, Charbonneau, together with my father and two other people, two other friends, bought an abandoned farmhouse in the Pyrenees Mountains. And there, every summer, we would spend a month, and very often the Charbonneau family was there also, for at least for a few days. And we would go hiking in the mountains. And even as a little boy, I would follow my father and Charbonneau, who were, going on fishing parties in the streams and the brooks in this area. And I remember when I caught my first trout, and Charbonneau was there, on the opposite side of the stream. So my relationship with Charbonneau is first very much, I don't know if this is correct, loaded, uh, heavily loaded with the sharing of the very sensuous experience of hiking, of swimming, of fishing in remote and very beautiful places, and which Charbonneau was very good at spotting. He had the training of a geographer. He was an historian. And it is on this basis that I became, this basis is of sharing pleasure of nature and in nature, that I became interested in Charbonneau's ideas. And also later, when Charbonneau was getting older, he would come to Bordeaux once in a while, and often he would stay in our home. And me and my wife also would also visit them, on a rather frequent basis. And when he was old and sick, so that was probably in 94 or 93, I told him that I wanted to write an introductory book on his thought. And I remember that he insisted that it should be on his thought and not on his person.
And that seems to be pretty characteristic of both Ellul and Charbonneau in their own ways, that they were, I mean, and I'm speaking all from secondhand knowledge from the reading that I've done, the conversations that I've had with folks who actually knew them, and then family, of course, who I've had the opportunity to spend some time with. But on the one hand, they were very inviting people, but on the other hand, they didn't want to be celebrities.
No. both of them uh, had decided very early that they would not do the usual thing, which is to get an academic job in Paris.
Yes, where all
Mhm.
the action and the intellectuals and the
Yeah.
celebrities were.
And
Yes.
being successful in French academia means that you go to Paris. Mhm. And they remain, Ellul remained in Bordeaux. That was a choice. Mhm. Uh, so that is also one of the reasons why uh, they had difficult time uh, being recognized as important thinkers.
Which is exactly why I want to start these types of conversations here, is because I want for myself and for others who are already in the conversation to get a clear picture of it, but people who may not even be aware of it to get a sense of it, because I think there are a lot of resources there that a lot of people haven't engaged with and haven't used. And so at this point, I think it would be helpful for you to bring these themes together, their biographies, their careers, the way that they thought, the way that they were as people. Can you bring that to bear on the personalism movements and what their roles were in personalism?
I think it lasted for 3 or 4 years. The, an active connection with the personalist movement in Paris. Mhm. And then there was a separation, and uh, so it is my understanding that the personalist movement was probably initiated in Germany uh, with thinkers like Max Scheler. There was, let's say, two branches of French personalism. One was more Catholic, with Emmanuel Mounier, who created the periodical Esprit. Now, Esprit at the beginning was quite interesting. First, they rejected communism, liberalism, and especially the liberal understanding of the individual. Mhm. And also they rejected fascism and the totalitarian tendencies of the politics of the time in the 30s. Mhm. They so this is why they especially Mounier focus on the notion of person, as an alternative to the uh, liberal understanding of the individual as isolated being. And so the person is the individual which maintains his connection to the community.
Right. So would you characterize that as not personalism is not humanism in the classic sense, the liberal idea of a sort of abstract human, right?
No.
But
As
a
Mhm.
but a more concrete vision of the person who's
Yeah.
not an ideal, but an actual embodied person in their surroundings, connected with their
Yes.
community.
So there was this, and you find that also in so there was the uh, Esprit branch, and there was also the Ordre Nouveau branch, which was more Protestant, with Denis de Rougemont, who was an important figure, and later also. And and Rougemont was definitely more Protestant. And okay, so they criticized capitalism, communism, fascism. They insisted also on the importance of daily life, how we behave in daily life, and how we relate with other people at our own level. And so there was a focus on uh, la vie quotidienne, which was something new and interesting.
Just for our non-French speaking viewers or listeners, that translates as very roughly, correct me if I'm wrong, Daniel, but everyday life, right? La vie
Yeah,
quotidienne is just
mm,
the mundane, the day-to-day
yeah,
stuff.
yeah, yeah. The sum of intellectuals which participated in the personalist movement were very conscious of the problem of the state, the problem of technology, and this tendency towards depersonalization in the modern world. So they agreed on that, and so you find intellectual like Charbonneau, Dandieu, Aron, which had a clear view on the fact that the growth of social mediation, such as institutions, the state, technology, all these apparatus which organize modern life is ambiguous and creates a depersonalization of life. Mhm.
Which ties to massification.
Yeah.
Yes, this idea that with all the things you mentioned, the
Mhm.
state, technology, all the
Mhm.
different political ideologies that you mentioned, what that does is create a massive people who are treated and
Yeah.
experience
Mhm.
the everyday life as an
Mhm.
anonymous herd, and they're
Yeah.
alienated and depersonalized.
So they insisted on the necessity of creating uh, grassroots communities. Mhm. They criticized the role of the function of money, of of the media, the press, for example. Mhm. They uh, and also about the necessity of criticizing contemporary commonplaces. It's kind of, apparently insignificant ideas which are shared by everybody.
Speaking of that, that is one of my favorite books that Ellul wrote is Critique of the New Commonplaces.
Yeah? Yeah.
It's not as
So that.
known
Mhm.
here, like in North
Mhm.
America, but it's
Mhm.
one of his most brilliant works because just to give a little background here, a commonplace or a cliche are those types of sayings that everybody will use in a everyday conversation, and they're inroads into ideology, or they're inroads into ways of viewing the world that everybody takes for granted, but we shouldn't, right? So
Mhm.
one among many that Ellul identifies and critiques is technology is neutral,
Mhm.
or you have to get your hands dirty,
Yeah.
and
Mhm.
other such cliches, some of which are still alive today and
Oh,
well,
yes, very
and
much
others
so.
we've had new cliches that have been
Mhm.
introduced since then, but basically
Mhm.
their interest in these commonplaces, it's almost kind of like discourse analysis, where you're taking ideas and bits and fragments of conversation and media and viewing those as through lines into wider ideologies and structures and so on.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So so there were two branches. The Ordre Nouveau was probably more radical, Mhm. More critical of and of the, the structures, mm, technological, organizational, and of economical of modern life. Mm. And they were considering the necessity of a revolutionary action, which they did not conceive as the normal political action. And so they uh, insisted on the necessity of building something new bottom up. The building blocks of a new uh, society, which they wanted, should be the person. And, uh, and the person and his integration in the community. So what they call the group de base, local groups, and that's an idea which you find in Charbonneau and Ellul in all their yeah, until they died.
I think it's really important to stress as well that they were looking for revolution, but looking outside of what political options were on offer in the
Exactly. Yeah.
mainstream. And just to draw that out a little bit, right? They wanted something that was different because when revolution was spoken of at that time, and we're seeing that today as well, if revolution is spoken of, there's typically an enemy that's identified that needs to be crushed.
Hmm.
And Ellul is clear on this in his account of personalism in Autopsy of Revolution, that yes, we need revolution, but a revolution that doesn't crush an enemy. That the person, that's the person in personalism, is the emphasis on the person and locality, is that
Hmm.
it's not the type of revolution that we need if somebody's getting crushed or oppressed.
Yeah.
The type of revolution we need is one in which values the person, whatever their background, whatever their story, whatever their view. Uh, that that's the type of revolution we need, which clearly at their time and in our time as well, it that it's sad to say, but that seems so contradictory to the way in which we think about politics and revolution today.
Hmm.
which is precisely why I find this movement so interesting and
Yes,
helpful.
especially at the beginning,
Yes.
because it was very creative for a few years and not so much after the war.
Hmm.
And Ellul was very clear in this. He says, after 1940, the personalist movement, at least esprit, uh, was much less interesting.
What made that so?
Because Emmanuel Mounier did not want to organize his movement on the basis of a critique of the state of technology, of money, and so on. What they called at that time les structures, the underlying structures of social life. And in fact, Mounier turned progressist. And so he was very critical of Charbonneau et Ellul, and also Bernanos. And he wrote an essay which was called Don't Be Afraid. Don't be afraid of progress. It's okay with progress. The only problem is capitalism. And once we get rid of capitalism, then technology will be a liberating force. There is no problem of technology per se.
Right.
And so whereas Ellul and Charbonneau, so that's what Christian Roy called the Gascon personalist. They insisted on the fact that we must criticize the structures, this underlying structure which organize our lives, and the state, technology, propaganda, money, and this was rejected by Mounier.
Yeah.
So already in 1940, during the war, he turned his back to this kind of criticism. And so there was a clash between Charbonneau and Ellul on one side and Mounier on the other side. And they said, okay, we are no longer part of the Esprit movement. And they developed their own thinking in an independent way, but unfortunately in a lonely way also. So after the war, they were by themselves. And so they realized that they could not start because in 33, when those two periodicals, Esprit and Ordre Nouveau, were published, they were excited. They thought that they had found a group of people who were thinking, whose thinking was convergent with their own thinking and their own critique of modern society. And And those who were really critical, like Rougemont and Dandieu, either uh, uh, gave up, like Rougemont, or died, like Dandieu. And on the side of the periodical esprit, it became, this kind of moderate left Christian and mostly Catholic periodical. And the radical critique of Charbonneau and Ellul was rejected. Okay, so but Ellul and Charbonneau thought that a revolutionary movement must be relying on two foundations. One is a good critique of modern society in order to understand what should we try to change. And this is an intellectual endeavor. And also construction of strong individuals and local groups. And they try to do that all their lives. So they deepened their analysis of the contradiction of modern world. They wrote many books, both of them, useful books. And also they wrote about what are the spiritual foundation of our critique and of our action in the modern world in order to change the world. So they wrote books, both of them, not only on a critique of the media, of money, of power, of the state, of technology, but also they wrote about freedom and the spiritual roots of freedom and what it means and why is freedom much more than a right. It is a calling, and it's the most difficult endeavor, the most unnatural thing
Yes.
that we can do. In both you find this two-pronged approach to the modern world, to the world. A critique of structures and a deepening of the spiritual foundation of an action, of a possible action. So for Ellul, he does that through his theological thinking. And Charbonneau wrote books on freedom, an existential analysis of why is freedom so difficult. Mhm. And also, he wrote a book which is called Une seconde nature, a second nature,
Mm.
about the man is aspiring to freedom, but he is also a social being. And the fact that he is deeply a social being uh, is also an obstacle, an inner obstacle to freedom.
Mm.
And this obstacle should be recognized and understood.
Ellul and Charbonneau, in their own way, said, actually, we are born into a world of determinisms.
Yeah.
And there is a desire for freedom, but this desire to belong, right? This is Charbonneau, as you're describing him, this desire to belong, to be in relationship, to be social, is constantly pulling us back towards conformity.
Yeah.
And so Ellul says, in one of my favorite quotes in Ethics of Freedom, is all this talk about freedom like it's a present that you unwrap. He said,
Mhm.
every time people are offered freedom, true freedom, they jump back in fright because it's scary to
It
live
is.
free of social
Mm.
determinisms that flatten people and depersonalize people is scary. You risk exclusion. You risk
Mm.
leaving behind the things that you think you can't live without. And of
Mhm.
course, for Ellul, he uses the image of the Exodus of Israel,
Yeah.
that they're liberated from captivity in Egypt
Yeah. Yeah. But
and
they
they're
don't want to
excited.
go.
But yeah, as soon
Mm.
as there's a challenge, they're like, can we go
Yeah.
back to slavery? We had
Yeah.
meat there.
And
Right?
sweet onions.
Yeah, exactly. And sweet vegetables. It's like, did you? And also, you were slaves. So,
Mhm.
would you rather have bread in the
Mhm.
wilderness and freedom, or would you rather have meat and sweet onions in
Mhm.
slavery?
Mhm.
That's their sort of push for freedom and how they're defining
Mhm.
it. But could you
Yeah.
speak to how they understood the spirit and spiritual? Because I think it's really important to establish that before we get into the fourth question that I had for you. What do they mean when they say spiritual? Because I think there's a risk, in the same way that we hear freedom and we think a very liberal understanding and expression of freedom, in the same way spirit tends to be viewed as a very thin or sort of liminal or numinous thing. And I don't think that that's how they viewed spirit or spiritual. Give it your best shot.
They are convinced, both of them, that uh, you are not free because you live in a kind of institutional context, uh, or economical context or technical, uh, which allows you to make choices. That's a fallacy for them.
Mm.
The choice is not what is, the possibility of choice is not what creates freedom. Uh, because most of the time, those choices are given to you. You have to choose between possibilities which are given to you. And freedom is something different from choosing. Freedom is action. Freedom is an effort for liberating oneself. And it is an endeavor to liberate oneself from oneself first.
Mm,
Mhm. From the conformist part of our personality.
mm,
So there is freedom only when we have a free act. And we are sometimes we are capable of a really free action. But it's always difficult. And freedom is here, it is present when we try to incarnate through our action our spiritual values against determination forces, which can be social, of course, but also psychological inside your head. Mhm. And sometimes also natural
mm.
or almost biological, like some kind of impulsivity. Uh, and this freedom can be only achieved by individuals. This a free act, a free action can be enacted only by individual. And Charbonneau is very explicit on that, and Ellul also. Uh, if you are Charbonneau, he says, well, we all pretend to be a free person, but if we look seriously, we discover how much we are determined
Mm.
in almost everything that we do. Mhm. And so I don't know how to translate that. He says, uh, freedom is an act of arrachement à soi-même, like uprooting something. You,
Right.
you
Yeah.
uproot yourself uh, from yourself, from your group, from your culture, and from your society.
Right. You
So
know,
in a way, and you do it because you are pushed by the need to incarnate your values.
yes.
So it's a spiritual thing.
Yeah. So I chuckled when you talked about the natural prompt that sort of awakens the spirit or the uprooting, because what I think about is so much of what the modern, late modern, postmodern, whatever modern you want to call it, experience is that we build these structures that protect us from the natural world, and we often live with the assumption that we're safe. And then every once in a while, a massive storm hits, or an earthquake happens, or a hurricane, or a flood. And we're reminded that we're not as safe as we think. And
No.
that terror that you feel when you realize that all it takes is for the power grid to go down, and the safety's gone, the convenience is gone, that is where I think we're locating this spirit and this inclination towards uprooting or freedom, like we're talking about. That could be interpreted as a sign of terror, or it could be the gateway into a realization that actually I'm not as safe as I thought. I'm not as secure as I thought. I'm actually more bound to my everyday structures and comforts way more than I thought I was. And I'm actually very determined and I'm kind of enslaved by them. And this is an opportunity to actually be less bound to those things,
Mm-hmm.
right? In the same way with the group, right? Like a political group, you join a political party, you have a feeling of excitement, you're ready to go, you're ready to participate. And then something happens within that group that you don't feel good about. That's the spirit saying, I don't agree here. I don't think this
Mm-hmm.
is the way that we should go. Are you going to say something? Are you going to do something? Or are you going to conform? And are you
Mm-hmm.
going to lie to yourself to continue? I think that
Yeah,
that
and
is
sometimes,
locating the spirit
mm,
because
yeah,
it's always attached to a very concrete existence and surrounding. It's not like we just need to retreat from our surroundings and be more spiritual, but we need to
no.
listen to that angst, that disturbance in the conscience. And if you don't have that disturbance in your conscience every once in a while, to what extent have you been suffocated by the world that we're in, right?
Yeah, and also both of them say that freedom is also grounded in the capacity of saying no.
Yeah.
No to my inner uh, impulsions, or to no to social ideas, and that in that sense we are all equal.
Mm,
Uh, uh, we are. Uh, it's not a question of being smarter or this ability of saying no. I cannot do that. You
right.
know, I don't want to live this way.
Yeah. And
Uh,
is there, this is the other impression that I have is there there are resonances with Nietzsche here, but the result is different.
yeah.
So with Nietzsche, of course, it's coming to awareness of illusions, false moralities, and of course
Hmm.
his his descriptions of resentment or resentment that
Hmm.
and so become aware of that and dismantle it and transcend it. But the where that goes for him is very different than where it goes for Ellul and Charbonneau, whereas it leads into the Ubermensch, the overman. For Nietzsche, like you're saying, for Ellul and Charbonneau and others, that's not moving towards a place of freedom and superiority over against anybody, but
No.
it's a movement towards equity
Hmm.
and encouraging others to similarly become conscious of their determinisms and transcend them. And only when we do that can we create the type of community that we
Hmm.
hopefully can create.
Yes, yes, you do, and but this is very difficult.
Yeah.
And this is so the as Charbonneau wrote,
Yeah.
freedom is the most difficult, and freedom creates anxiety.
Yes. Yes.
So I mean that's Kierkegaard's idea, and Charbonneau and Ellul, as you know, read Kierkegaard,
Yes,
and
absolutely.
uh, and and this uh, uh, this angst is what we try to reject as much as possible. We don't want to be in situations which create anxiety, you know,
Yes.
and we we don't like this kind of inner conflict with ourselves, with our environment, and so we we tend to reject freedom because it's too uncomfortable. It makes us uncomfortable. Mhm.
Mhm.
And uh, and both of them insist all the time. You know, in their books, you know, it's a leitmotif. Uh, uh, Man dreams about freedom, but he doesn't stand it. Mhm.
Mhm. And, talk about a career mobility plan, right? Making a career out of telling people they're not free.
Mhm.
That really does get to the heart of why they were so excluded, why their work is valuable, but why the work has been and continues to be ignored, right?
Yeah. So in a way, both of them, through their analysis of the state, for example, for Charbonneau, or technology with Ellul, they say, well, one of the way to uh, get away from anxiety, from angoisse, as we say in French, is to get power,
Mm-hmm.
power and control. So there is for both of them, there is a contradiction between the spirit of power and the spirit of freedom. And it's a contradiction which is complicated because there is no freedom without any power. We must, if freedom is in action, we must act. We must exercise some power. Mhm. But this power should be limited because too much power kills freedom,
Yes.
destroys the possibility of freedom, and especially the search for unlimited power, whether it is technological, political, economical.
Yeah,
And so
absolutely.
there is a complicated dialectics
Yes.
between l'esprit de puissance, the spirit of power, and the spirit of freedom. Uh, but we need some power, but we should not succumb to the spirit of power,
Mm.
because power by itself becomes autonomous. And its own growth tends to destroy the possibility of authentic freedom. Mm.
This is where I find Ellul's ethics of non-power very helpful in distinguishing what is helpful power that's handled carefully,
Mm.
and power that takes on the characteristics that you're talking about here. Because Ellul says there's a difference between an ethic of non-power and not having power to begin with, right? So the ethic of non-power that he develops in his work is to say that if you have power, part of the way in which you become free is being willing to give it away. And will I share what I have so that collectively we might be able to act as individuals and together in this spirit of freedom?
Mhm.
And that to me is an ethic that is sorely, sorely needed today. So, with that said, what other resources do you think personalism and Ellul and Charbonneau offer us for today? I feel like there's so much that has come up in our conversation so far, but if there's one or two themes that we've talked about or haven't talked about that you think are very valuable for today, what would those be?
No, right now I don't know how to answer your question.
Hmm.
I think that what is very valuable, and I think that's one of the reasons, for example, I've been spending a lot of energy for the last 15 years trying to having Charbonneau's book published or republished. I think they provide uh, intellectual tools for those who want to act in society, especially understanding the power of the structures we live in. And also, they give us some very important insights about the values and the spiritual foundation of an action, of a personal and collective action, and also of the, would you say, entrappings?
Yeah, the entrappings
Yeah.
or
Uh,
the trappings.
yeah, which we should uh, avoid. And it's better to be conscious of these entrappings if we want to avoid them. And for that, they give us some very precious insights. And and
Yeah.
and and especially both of them are very. I mean, Ellul expressed that in theological terms about his critique of the esprit de puissance and the spirit of non-power, the ethics of non-power. But in although he is not religious, and that is important, uh, Charbonneau leads us into a very similar direction, especially when he says that there, at some point, there will be a contradiction between freedom and power. And so that we are mistaken when we think that the more powerful we are, the more free we are. It's material power may the quest, the uncontrolled quest for material power may result in the destruction of freedom, which is at the root of the search for power.
The other basic reality in Ellul and Charbonneau's relationship that you just mentioned, and even the communities that they were a part of, you didn't have to be religious or not religious to be a part of that community.
No?
And I think even the witness of that today, that Ellul being the committed Christian that he was, Protestant Reformed Christian, and Charbonneau coming from his perspective, he identified as an agnostic, correct?
Yeah.
Yes.
Mhm.
That they still had a lifelong friendship. They influenced each other's thought and activism. And despite their failures, they had some successes. And so, even just that reality about the personalist movements is that it really was a diverse group. And I think that is also a value that I think is lacking today and needs to be cultivated, is to say, one thing that we can hopefully agree on is that we're all people, and centering the person and our surroundings, our very real, concrete, local surroundings, in our consideration of what our problems are and what the solutions to those problems are. We can do that, and it's in our interest to do that. And we don't have to do it just with people who think exactly like we do and live exactly like we do and want to approach things in exactly the same way that we do, but actually by rooting our focus in the person and moving towards like true lasting freedom together and individually. Like, I think that is also a value that is at the core of their life and work and their expression of personalism that is really important to draw out and emphasize as well. Would you agree with that?
Yes, and what is also is important is that both of them tried to live according to their thinking, which is which is not easy.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. That for people who are intellectually inclined, myself included, practicing what you preach and preaching what you
Mhm.
practice is complex and difficult. But I think people like Charbonneau and Ellul give us a lot of resources to do that well. So thank you so much for your time. It's been such a valuable conversation, and I look forward to more conversations with you and others here, because this is just the start of many more conversations like this one, Daniel. Thank you so much.
Okay, that's a pleasure. Thank
Yeah.
you.